Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the invisible machinery that literally keeps our modern world moving. I mean, billions of dollars worth of goods cross the oceans every single day, right? But have you ever stopped to wonder what actually happens when things go wrong? We're going to dive into the fascinating, incredibly high-stakes legal frameworks that dictate exactly who foots the bill when cargo is delayed, damaged, or just completely lost at sea. It is an epic battle between the traditional old guard laws and the modern innovators. And spoiler alert, the outcome affects the cost of almost everything you and I buy. Let's get into it.
Here's how we're breaking it down today. First, what exactly is covered? Second, who's responsible and when? Third, liability and financial limits. Fourth, the great package debate. And fifth, resolving maritime disputes. Okay, kicking things off with Section 1, what exactly is covered? So the very first hurdle is figuring out what kinds of shipments these different rule books actually care about. Because, you can't hold a shipping company liable if your cargo isn't even legally recognized, right? This perfectly illustrates the massive gap between the old ways and the new. Take the old guard, the Hague and Hague-Visby rules. They only apply to outward bills of lading. And get this, they completely exclude cargo carried on the ship's deck. And they don't cover live animals at all. So pretty bad news if you're trying to ship a cow. But then we have the modern innovators, the Hamburg Rules and the Multimodal Act. They modernize the whole shebang to cover virtually everything. We're talking all carriage contracts, inward and outward shipments. And yes, they finally included protections for deck cargo and livestock. The scope of protection just exploded. Moving right along to Section 2. Who is responsible and when? Now that we know what's covered, let's look at exactly when a carrier is legally on the hook. The old Hague and Hague-Visby rules relied on this highly restrictive time frame known in the biz as tackle-to-tackle liability. Basically, the carrier is only responsible for your goods from the precise second the ship's crane, the tackle, hooks the cargo to load it to the exact moment it sets it down at the destination port. Literally anything that happens before that hook attaches or after it lets go, totally not their problem. Oh, and to make it even easier for them, they had a generous list of 17 different legal exemptions for cargo care. Talk about a sweetheart deal. But thankfully, the modern innovators threw that narrow tackle-to-tackle window right out the porthole. Under the Hamburg Rules and the Multimodal Act, the carrier just has a general duty of care for the entire time the goods are in their charge. Period. It's so much safer for your cargo. They also introduced a really crucial distinction between the contractual carrier, the company you sign the paperwork with, and the actual carrier, which is the company physically driving the ship. The old guard rules completely ignored that nuance, which, as you can imagine, caused a lot of headaches. Which brings us to Section 3, liability and financial limits. Okay, so a shipment goes sideways and the clock immediately starts ticking. As a business owner, you desperately need to know what a delay is actually going to cost you. Now, dealing with delays under the old Hague rules was a total nightmare because loss due to delay was merely implied. There was no hard and fast rule. The modern frameworks finally fix this by establishing an express, hard countdown. If your goods are delayed, you can legally declare the shipment totally lost if it isn't delivered within 60 consecutive days under the Hamburg Rules or 90 consecutive days under the Multimodal Act. It finally gave shippers some absolute, much-needed legal clarity. Right, but what happens when you actually need to get paid for that lost cargo? To understand the payout limits, we first have to define something called an SDR, or Special Drawing Right. See, because we're dealing with international trade, relying on just one country's currency to calculate liability is a terrible idea when you factor in decades of inflation and exchange rate chaos. So the SDR acts as an international reserve asset metric. It essentially replaced older static currencies to help standardize financial liability all across the globe. What's really fascinating here is tracking the historical evolution of the actual payout. Under the original Hague rules, the limit was just a flat 100 British pounds per package. Hague-Visby tried to update things using Poincaré francs, but look at the modern standard. The Multimodal Act shifted this to roughly 666 SDR, and the Hamburg rules bumped it up even higher to a much more sophisticated 835 SDR per package or 2.5 SDR per kilogram. I mean, that jump is a massive difference in financial protection. They finally built a robust system that could actually keep pace with the modern global economy. All right, moving into Section 4, and this is a fun one, the great package debate. So all those financial limits we just talked about were heavily tied to a per-package rate, and that tiny little detail led to arguably the most absurd and heavily litigated interpretational problem in maritime history.
I know it sounds like a joke, but the legal system desperately needed to define what actually constitutes a single package. Think about it. When your liability limit is strictly capped per package, the financial difference between shipping one giant package versus 10 small ones is astronomically huge, and this ambiguity sparked some absolutely bizarre courtroom battles.
Courts were forced to repeatedly interpret this seemingly simple word through a wild series of cases. We're talking foundational battles recorded in the history books like Gulf Italia, SS Navigator, Island Yacht Inc., and Pacific Bear. We aren't just talking about standard cardboard boxes here. Judges were looking at giant yachts or massive pieces of unpackaged machinery and having to answer the deep philosophical question, is this technically a package?
And as shipping technology evolved, a massive loophole opened up that absolutely terrified shippers. The invention of the metal intermodal shipping container totally revolutionized global trade, right? But it prompted a scary question. If you stuff, say, 1,000 expensive electronics into a single massive metal shipping container, does the carrier only have to pay you for one single package if that container sinks to the bottom of the ocean? Yikes. As you can probably guess, carriers naturally argued, yep, just one package, because they wanted to limit their total liability to a single small payout for the whole container. So shippers took them to court. Major cases like Leather's Best, Royal Typewriter, and Tindafil wrestled with this exact dilemma. The courts were literally clogged with multi-million-dollar disputes, and the entire verdict rested on whether a metal box was just a transport device or a package all on its own. Fortunately, the modern rules finally provided a brilliant yet incredibly simple fix to all this chaos. Hague-Visby and the Hamburg Rules introduced a strict clarification. The official paperwork, the bill of lading, must explicitly declare the exact N number of individual packages hidden inside that container. So, if your bill of lading says there are 500 packages inside the metal box, the liability is calculated for 500 packages. Boom! Loophole closed once and for all. And that leads us to our final section, Section 5, Resolving Maritime Disputes.
Okay, so the rules are clear on packages, liability, and responsibility. But when all else fails, negotiations break down, and you actually have to take legal action, how do these rulebooks govern the dispute process? Well, as a shipper, you face a strict ticking clock to file a lawsuit, known as the limitation of action, and the timeline varies wildly depending on which rules apply. On the super short end, you've got a brutal 9-month window under the Multimodal Act. Hague and Hague-Visby give you a standard 1-year mark. But if you're under the Hamburg rules, you get a much more forgiving 2-year window, which can even be extended. And trust me, you need to know this because if you miss your specific window, your multi-million-dollar claim just completely vanishes. Plus, where and how you fight this battle really matters. Ultimately, the older Hague and Hague-Visby rules heavily tilted the jurisdictional playing field toward the carrier, making it incredibly tough for the shipper to sue in a location that was actually convenient for them. They also just completely ignored any express provisions for arbitration. The modern innovators, on the other hand, intentionally leveled the playing field. Hamburg and Multimodal established jurisdiction rules that are actually fair to both parties, and they expressly outline how to bypass the courts entirely and just use arbitration. It's a real game changer. All of this leaves us with a fascinating and maybe slightly unsettling reality. See, the transition from the old guard to the modern innovators hasn't been completely unified on a global scale. Because global trade still navigates this crazy patchwork of old and new laws simultaneously, it forces us to ask which of these invisible rulebooks is truly dictating the risks, the liabilities, and ultimately the consumer costs behind every single thing you buy. It is definitely something to chew on the next time you're tracking a package across the globe. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and